Mental Maps is brought to you by Well. Well is a virtual holistic mental health service, providing psychiatric evaluations, holistic interventions, and when needed, medication management. For more information, check out Well at www.arukawell.co. That's www.arukawell.co. Welcome back to Mental Maps. As always, I hope this finds you well no matter what season of life you're in. Today, I am honored to be joined by Patrick Hahn. Patrick, welcome.
Thank you.
Awesome. Dr. Hahn, your work is so interesting. And one of the things we like to do in this show is just jump right into the meat of it, right? And so, your work, whether it be the books you publish or your research papers or even the work that you do through Mad in America and some of these other outlets, it's really brought up a concept that everyone's talking about, right? Whether it be in the field of psychiatry, in the world of therapy, whatever that looks like. I guess kind of give us a rundown of this, right? This understanding of mental illness and how we got to this place.
Okay. Well, I'll begin by saying I'm not a psychologist or a psychiatrist or any kind of medical doctor. I don't want anyone to think I'm trying to pass myself off as one. My background is in evolutionary biology, and I've never claimed that this gives me any special authority in these matters, but it has given me a perspective which I believe is undervalued. It's perfectly obvious to me that our bodies are the product of over 500 million years of evolution. Our bodies evolved to function, and to function very well. They did not evolve to malfunction. And two is that our bodies evolved to function for a time, and then to die and get the hell out of the way of the next generation. And so I've long regarded with distaste this currently fashionable view of ourselves as fragile creatures who need huge amounts of fantastically expensive medical interventions from cradle to grave to keep us alive. And I began looking into these matters, and it was like falling down a rabbit hole. The more I learned, the crazier it seemed. And I became aware of some capacities in myself that were going underutilized. So at the preposterously advanced age of 51, I went back to school, and I enrolled in the science writing program at Johns Hopkins University. And it's been quite a ride. Now, at the callow age of 64, I have had 4 books released by mainstream international publishers. And but the best thing about this journey has been the people I've met along the way. The patient advocates who never wanted to be patient advocates, but found themselves forced into that role after they or a loved one took the drugs as prescribed in good faith and suffered devastating consequences, including suicide, including homicide, and also the experts that I've met that have dissented from the prevailing narrative. These are men and women with impeccable scientific credentials, but who still have managed to hold on to their essential humanity. So it's been quite a ride, and it just keeps getting better.
Well, one of the things that you bring up, and evolutionary biology is so interesting. I've read some of the work of Brett Weinstein and Heather Harry, that whole crew, and they talk a lot about how like social evolution and what that looks like as well. But in the context of mental illness, like how did we get to this place, whether it be socially or whatever that looks like, and I've read some of your work of emotions becoming pathologized? Like, how do we get to there?
Well, beginning in the early modern era, I mean, there have always been people who manifestly are incapable of taking care of themselves. And beginning in the early modern era, in Western civilization, they built asylums for these people. And these places needed their medical superintendents to attend to the medical needs of their residents. And they were called madhouse doctors and even less complimentary names. But I have no doubt they did their best with the state of the knowledge of the time to attend to their charges' medical needs. And in the early 19th century, the German asylum doctor Johann Ryle coined the term psychiatry for this specialty. And now, at the time, nobody thought of anxiety or depression or madness as an illness. But as the 19th century wore on, these medical superintendents, or psychiatrists as they were now known, began increasingly to think in those terms. And there's a couple of factors why. A lot of these asylums were placed in rural settings, and it's a belief, probably correct, that bucolic settings would help their patients, help the residents' recovery. And so you had these medical superintendents in these isolated backwaters, and their specialty was regarded as with some degree of scorn by other medical specialties. And it's just understandable to believe that it's perfectly understandable that these medical superintendents in these isolated backwaters would dream of becoming famous for finding a cure for these conditions. And then, of course, in the early 20th century, these asylum doctors decided they did not want to work in an asylum anymore. And so they began claiming dominion over more and more problems of human thoughts and feelings and behaviors. By the late 1970s, psychiatry was facing a crisis of identity that threatened its very existence. The um, the so-called minor tranquilizers had been exposed as the dangerous and highly addictive drugs they were. The so-called major tranquilizers were derided by the patients forced to take them as instruments of torture. Other somatic interventions, like lobotomy and insulin coma, were as discredited as bloodletting. There was entire new professions, clinical psychologists and counselors, who, and no doubt, a lot of psychiatrists did some good as individuals in their capacity in talk therapy, but study after study had shown that clinical psychologists and counselors could do the same job and a lot more cost effectively. And now there was an army of lay therapists, uh, Erhard seminar training, and some even more disreputable outfits purporting to alleviate these conditions. Psychiatrists had the lowest salary of any medical specialty. Books like Thomas Saz's The Myth of Mental Illness and E. Fuller Torrey, this was before he went over to the dark side, his book, The Death of Psychiatry, questioned the very concept of mental illness. So by 1979, psychiatry was facing a crisis of identity that threatened its very existence. And there were articles in Time magazine and New York Times publicizing this. So psychiatry was at a crossroads. And practicing psychiatrists could have put their efforts into talk therapy and accepted the same salary as a clinical psychologist or a social worker. Medical schools could have started shuttering residency programs in psychiatry. The American Psychiatric Association could have merged with the other APA, the American Psychological Association. And in short, they could have begun the process of dismantling psychiatry as a profession. And of course, they didn't do that. They instead embarked on a vigorous rebranding campaign. And the linchpin of this was the third iteration of the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, or DSM. And this has gotten bigger and bigger with each iteration. The second version was a little over 100 pages. The third version was 400 and some pages. The fourth was 500 and some. Now it's over 1,000 pages. And this multiplication of different diagnostic categories is starting to look like the proliferation of epicycles in the Ptolemaic system of astronomy 500 years ago. It's a sign that this paradigm is on its last legs. And the drug companies had nothing to do with DSM-3. In fact, the stated intention of DSM-3 was to narrow the range of conditions treated by psychiatrists. But with each iteration, they got more and more diagnostic categories. The categories became broader until now. I see no difference between quote unquote mental illness and everyday unhappiness. So this profession is now claiming dominion over every significant problem of human thoughts and feelings and behaviors. And of course, the bad news for psychiatry just keeps piling up. In 2009, Irving Kirsch published his devastating critique of antidepressants, so-called antidepressants. In short-term trials, bought and paid for by the drug makers, these pills are no better than placebos. In the long term, they cause worsening depression. They can be ferociously addictive. I know some patients, advocates don't like it when I use the word addictive, but they are addictive according to the dictionary definition of the word. And that's the only definition we have. I think it's incredibly disingenuous of psychiatry to abolish the word addiction from their lexicon and claim these drugs are not addictive. And they've spent billions of dollars, many lifetimes, trying to find a biological cause of illness. They've come up with nothing. Zilch. There's no abnormality of brain structure that is diagnostic of so-called mental illness. There's no abnormality of brain function that is diagnostic of so-called mental illness. There is no gene for mental illness. And then in just a couple of years ago, 3 years ago, Joanna Moncrief and her colleagues put forth a review of the serotonin hypothesis of depression. I remember in the 1990s, everybody knew depression was caused by a deficiency of serotonin. And the cure was to take a pill get your serotonin levels elevated, like topping up your brake fluid. And it turns out there was no evidence for this, not weak evidence, not equivocal evidence, no evidence. And it just seems to me the whole paradigm has been as repudiated as it could be. But the drug makers they show no signs of slowing up. More and more people are taking these drugs, and as more and more people take them, the rate of people disabled by mental illness keeps going up. That makes no sense if you think these drugs cure mental illness. It
Well,
makes perfect sense
yeah.
if you think these drugs cause mental illness.
Well, I'd love to talk about too, so you talk about that transition that happened in the DSM-3. And when you look at that from 1 and 2, you have really these experiences that were reactions to something occurring, right? So you had hysteria, you had melancholy, and we know they existed because you've seen people be really unwell, right? Like, Freud's writings, and no matter what we say within that, people were having these emotional reactions, right? And then, I've read some of the look back, if you will, of when this transition occurred in 3, where it stopped being an emotional reaction and moved into this like pathology, right? Like kind of how we see diabetes and how we see cardiac disorders and that kind of thing. And so what I'm hearing you say within that is that transition, right? That move attempting to give more science to this experience, remove it from being more emotion and being less about emotion and more about the pathology. That was kind of this transition that kind of led us into this place that was a catalyst to this increase in prevalence that we've now seen across the board from mental health.
Yes, that's correct. In the earlier DSM 1 and 2, the earlier iterations of DSM, these conditions were called reactions:
Right.
depressive reaction, anxiety reaction, schizophrenic reaction. And DSM 3 purported to be agnostic about their causes. Um, and since then, they have generated just boxcars full of studies on the so-called biological roots of so-called mental illness, and they found nothing. We've had a century of psychiatric genetics investigations, more than 80 years of psychiatric brain imaging studies, and they have come up with nothing. And
And
yet we still see these accounts in the popular press, which appear like clockwork, and about the latest amazing discovery. And they usually have these pictures of the brain lit up in all colors. They look very impressive. They don't mean anything, but they certainly look impressive. Earlier this year, there was a study published about they found 308 genes for depression, for major depression. And they said that together, these 308 genes account for 5% of population liability for depression. Okay, so if we take them at their word, this is a condition whose lifelong incidence is 10%. And so 10% of 5% divided by 308 is something like 1 in 50,000. So each of these genes, on average, has a purported effect size of 1 in 50,000 increase in your chances of having major depression. Now, how can a 1 in 50,000 increase in risk be anything but a meaningless statistical abstraction? This is the modern day equivalent of medieval clerics arguing over how many angels can dance on the head of a pin.
Well, and one of the things that I highlight too, when we're talking about the no evidence of the cause of mental illness, there's a gamut of discussion and research and all these things out there. Some are a little bit different than others, and you do see where like during times of chronic stress, people who've experienced really traumatic experiences, when you think about traumatic brain injury, you do see some of those damages. But what you're kind of highlighting is that within these disorders, when you start talking about DSM-3, 4, 5, and then you've got all of these pathology kind of labels, in those labels, there's never been really seen a cause. Like we don't have like a brain scan that's like, there's your problem. And so within that, that's really led us into this huge discussion. And so within your work, when you think about the human body and the human brain being this anti-fragile, wildly resilient kind of organism, no matter what we kind of talk about within that, where did this come from? Like, how did we get to a place where some people do have these emotional reactions that look like hysteria or melancholy and that kind of stuff compared to the average, just, I'm sad?
Yeah, well, my first book was on the purported genetic basis of so-called mental illness, with an emphasis on schizophrenia.
Mm-hmm.
Now, schizophrenia is the diagnostic category, which corresponds more or less to what used to be called madness. Uh, and it's considered, of all the conditions called mental illness, it's considered the most severe and the one most likely to have a genetic basis. And after demonstrating, now I contend schizophrenia is not even a coherent diagnostic category, but you don't even need to accept that to accept the rest of my argument.
Mm.
After concluding that the complaints that fall under the diagnostic rubric of schizophrenia are in no way, no how inherited, I was naturally led to the question, what does cause them? And I found there is a mountain of studies showing that these complaints are caused, not triggered, caused by child sexual abuse,
Mm.
physical abuse, emotional abuse, and every other category of trauma and loss. The correlation is robust, reliable, dose dependent. Uh, it cuts across income brackets, it cuts across ethnic identities, it cuts across national boundaries. It has been demonstrated again and again in case control studies, cross sectional studies, population based cohort studies. Uh, there is no doubt. What common sense tells us is correct. Bad things happen, and they can drive you crazy.
Mm. Yeah, and I think, that's something you see from I know you've referenced, this discussion in some of your writings, but the book Hidden Valley Road and just that family and that huge discussion that happened between the schizophrenic mother and the genetic component and all these things. And we do know the brain can become unwell to the point of your senses becoming erratic, primarily because we see that with people who use methamphetamine sometimes. And whether that's due to the methamphetamine itself, whether it's due to staying up all night, whatever that is, you do have people who for a short amount of time will hear things, see things, and then sometimes they come back, sometimes they don't. That's its own kind of brain chemistry experience. But within that, what you're talking about is within that nature versus nurture component, it was way more based on what happens to that human being than anything else.
Yeah, it's interesting you bring up Hidden Valley Road. I reviewed that book on Mad in America. This was um, the Galvin family. They had 12 children, 10 boys, followed by 2 girls. So 10 sons, 6 of the sons were diagnosed with schizophrenia. And this supposedly was held up by the author as proof that this is an inherited condition. And he interleaves this with accounts of uh, psychiatric genetics researchers who are looking for the cause of schizophrenia. And there was no doubt these boys, these young men, were highly disturbed. Believe one, I don't remember the details now, but I think one viciously attacked police officers and was incarcerated and attacked the staff. One tried to murder his wife. And you find out that the oldest boy was sexually abused by a family friend. The father had apparently he was a brilliant man, very accomplished, but he just didn't seem to have much interest in being a dad to the 12 children he fathered. And that opened up the door for a quote unquote family friend to come in. And the mother was desperate for help from anyone. And this family friend molested the oldest son. Kolker, the author, doesn't get around to dropping this bombshell till page 239 of the book, as if this were an unimportant detail. And he then proceeded to molest his younger brothers, who then proceeded to bully and molest their younger siblings. The boys were experimenting with what sounds like a pharmacopoeia of illegal drugs, weed, cocaine, God knows what else. And then once you get the diagnosis of schizophrenia, you're off to the races. More drugs, stronger drugs, higher doses, brain disabling electrical shocks, and till somebody who may have started out with no more than the problems of living ends up a career mental patient. And that's what happened. And I believe, and we'll never know the full truth about this family. 3 of the 6 sons are dead. And according to Kolker, 2 of them died as a direct result of their treatment. And the others have memories that are impaired by years and years and years of damaging and violent treatments. But he set out to prove the genetic basis of schizophrenia, but as far as I'm concerned, he proved the exact opposite.
Well, and I think you bring up, the concept of the things happening to people, and as things happen to people that then can, cause the brain to become unwell. Like, I mean, ultimately, right? I mean, you're having all these terrible things happen to you. In your work and your research, have you seen something that kind of says, like, what everybody asks all the time is the why? Like, why does the human mind find itself, for some people, becoming so overwhelmed with what happens to them that they do just kind of break, or especially in the world of schizophrenia, they do break?
Yeah, well, if you're living in an abusive environment where violence may be unleashed upon you any moment, a state of hypervigilant awareness is exactly what you need to survive. But in the wider world, that's called paranoia. And then delusions of persecution are the brain's attempt to rationalize this paranoid state. In my first book, I had a whole chapter to, they were called the Janane sisters. That was a pseudonym. Their actual name is now a matter of public. I chose not to reveal their name, but their name is now a public record. The Morlock sisters. 4 identical quadruplets born in, I think it was 1932. And all four, as young women, were diagnosed with schizophrenia. And this study was held up for decades and they brought them to the NIMH. This is back in the 50s. And they did all kinds of tests on them, EEGs and uh, hormone levels and fingerprint ridge counts and handwriting analysis and God knows what else. And the NIMH researchers produced a big, thick book over 600 pages with 25 authors. And this study for decades was held up as proof of the genetic nature of schizophrenia, which is just complete and utter nonsense. And it turned out, and again, this was preposterously self-refuting. There's an account of the lives of these girls before they went to the NIMH, and now as as quadruplets, they were the media, the local papers were constantly doing these charming little puff pieces about them. But as it turned out, behind closed doors, it was a horror show in there. Sexual abuse, physical abuse, emotional abuse, substance abuse, domestic violence. The father almost certainly murdered another man. Details are in my book. And then by the way, something they don't tell you in the book, but which I uncovered through my own investigation. The father was not just a fat pig of a bully. He was also a cop.
Mm.
Now imagine you're a young mother in the 1940s, 30s or 40s with four crazy daughters and a husband who said he's going to kill you if you try to leave him. And as I said, he's not just a fat pig of a bully, he's a cop. What were her chances of getting away from him? And she did not have strong family support. Her chances were zero. Yeah, that book is like a how-to manual on spousal abuse and child abuse. He made sure to isolate the mother and the children. He allowed only the most limited contact. She allowed his wife only the most limited contact with her family. He made sure to read all of her letters before they went out. The girls were not allowed to play with other children, not even their own cousins. And the father, as I mentioned, he once fired a gun at his wife. He didn't hit her, but he put a hole through her nightgown. And he claimed he thought she was a burglar. He told the girls, he kept them in line with threats to murder them, threats to murder their mother. He almost certainly did murder another man. The details are in my book. And for the rest of his life, he would wake up from nightmares of murder, screaming, and demand his gun and search the house for intruders. Now, imagine you're one of these girls, and there's a maniac with a gun running through your house night after night. What are you going to do? You're going to hunker down under the covers and make yourself as still and quiet as you possibly can. And in their 20s, all four were diagnosed with catatonic schizophrenia. Well, what is catatonia? That's precisely the response they needed to survive growing up in that hellhole.
Mm. Mm. And I think you bring up such a good point with and we see this a lot, especially like in delusions and like delusional disorders, where there's definitely a purpose and a meaning behind them, and you see where as it continues to grow, the pathology looks very unwell, but there's a meaning up underneath it, right? And many times it's because, things have happened to people and it just becomes so overwhelming to kind of have those experiences. And so then the brain just kind of loses traction and kind of gets out there, right?
Yes.
Within that and some of the work that you've done, you kind of see where, you know, as it moves from a reaction to a pathology, it definitely gets, you know, like looked at and kind of really blown up in pop culture. And as we've kind of moved into this world now, specifically in the last like few years of discussions on diet and herbs and minerals, and I would see almost too that many times you see people who have melancholy or who have anxiety issues, activation issues, whatever we want to call them, and it's just a reaction to something they're putting in their body, something that they don't have enough of in their body, something that's going
Mhm.
on somewhere else, like a thyroid disorder or something like that. Do you kind of see that, maybe as that transition occurred where we moved from reaction to pathology, we almost had a chunk of time here where we pushed all of that other stuff aside and said it has to be a brain issue. It has to be something in the brain when really it was a gamut of things that can make these experiences happen?
Yeah, sure. There, you raise a good point. The diagnostic criteria for schizophrenia are so broad. There's actual physical illnesses that can create these symptoms: heavy metal toxicity, head injuries, autoimmune disorders, and in these cases, diagnosing a person with schizophrenia or depression or ADHD or what have you, and then giving them drugs to mask the symptoms is just a preposterous distraction from finding out what has actually gone wrong with a person. Just a couple years ago, there was a story in the Washington Post about a young woman who, at the age of 17, was diagnosed with schizophrenia and committed to a mental hospital. And now they knew that this young woman also suffered from lupus, but didn't occur to anybody there might be a connection. And 20 years later, and she was catatonic most of this time, 20 years later, uh, they decided to run some tests and they found out the lupus was attacking her brain.
Mm,
And
mm,
this is a condition that medicine can actually treat, although it's not treated by psychiatrists. But this is a condition that medicine can treat. And so they gave her appropriate treatment. She was able to go home, but she'll never get those 20 years back. What a horrible waste.
yeah. So so it's almost as if, when we kind of look at these experiences from a biological perspective, there's there's definitely something occurring. Many times it's a reaction, and then we've kind of seen kind of this evolving of the pathology. So when you look at it from like a prevalence perspective, right? Like we live in this world that's identified as very anxious. It's identified as having a lot, the huge uptick of sadness, a huge uptick of like harming of one another, all these things, right? Do you feel like it's more of just a reaction of everything that's happening around, or is it more due to the popularity of these experiences?
Well, yeah, there's a definite um, element of social contagion here. Um, just this morning in my Facebook feed, there came a video of a mother holding a uh, mental illness reveal for her young son, like a gender reveal for a pregnant couple. And he cut into a cake, and if it was one color, he had ADHD. And if it was another color, he had autism. I'm thinking, my God. Yeah. And, when I was a boy, I understood uh, the term mental illness to mean just hallucinations or paranoia or crippling depression or anxiety. Nobody wanted a diagnosis of mental illness. In fact, these diagnostic labels were the source of great shame and stigma. But nowadays, I turn on YouTube and I see these young people giving their TEDx talks, and they're healthy and articulate, bright eyed, and bragging about their struggles with mental illness. And a lot of them will even come out and say, I was never abused. I had two nice parents. And then they pat themselves on the back for fighting stigma. And they always end to rousing applause, thereby demonstrating there is no stigma to identifying yourself as mentally ill. Yes, my heart goes out to people who are suffering anxiety or depression or uh, schizophrenia because of past trauma. But if you're a healthy young person, you were never abused or traumatized, you were never raped or kidnapped, you were never in a war, you didn't lose a parent at an early age, nothing like that ever happened to you, and you still identify as mentally ill, then you need to learn to buck up. And you can either take my word for it or learn the hard way.
And
Yeah, I'm afraid some of these young people are on the road to lifelong careers as mental patients.
and I think what you're kind of saying in that too is that in the midst of this emergence of the prevalence of the popularity of I wouldn't say popularity, but you could say that, right? Of mental issues, the experience of human discomfort was pathologized, and so within human discomfort, right, the uncomfortable feelings of life, sadness, nervousness, activation, and even some of the stuff that happens biologically, right, like some of the work of Chris Palmer and his team of talking about the hyperexcitable and hypoexcitable and stuff that happens in your mitochondria and all these things that occur, right, that are reactions in your body. Many times it's just a lot of it is due to that absence of being able to manage the discomfort. And so now it seems like there's a label you can put on that discomfort. And within that comes this whole world that you're talking about that's evolved over time.
Yeah, I was talking with Al Galvez last year. He's a clinical psychologist. He was the principal investigator on this study of NIMH grants I recently was involved with. And he said that all mental illness is an attempt to avoid pain. And sometimes that's understandable. I mean, say you're we know that one of the risk factors for eating disorders and obesity is child sexual abuse. Well, if you're a child who's being abused, uh, there aren't many ways open to you to dull that pain. But one of the ways is overeating. You watch that show, My 600-Pound Life. One after another will say they were sexually abused as children. And yeah, of course. But yeah, it goes back to what I was saying. These coping strategies that may be essential for survival when you're a child can be horribly maladaptive in the
Mm.
wider world.
And I think that's interesting that you bring that up too, is that, kids are wildly resilient, right? Humans
Yeah.
are wildly resilient, but kids especially are wildly resilient. And so you've, as a kid, I mean, I've worked with kids for years, and one of the things that you see from kids is they find ways to navigate very terrible circumstances because they don't have ultimately a lot of control, right? And so then within that, you're kind of saying that as they get older, these coping strategies, these mechanisms of navigating these very, very terrible situations, they then become maladaptive, and then they can kind of fall into the criteria almost of what a mental health disorder looks like. And so within that, that then opens up the whole door when really it's just a reaction to what occurred that became maladaptive.
Yeah. Yeah. One of the risk factors for being in an abusive relationship as an adult is having been abused as a child. Now, you would think somebody who was abused, you might think someone who was abused as a child would be especially wary, mostly women, would be especially wary of abusive men as an adult. But it doesn't work that way. I mean, we all use what we have. And if you grow up, spend your childhood finding ways to placate an abusive tyrant, uh, that's what you have. And that's what you're going to use as an adult. So, yeah, I mean, life tends to be regressive, or as they used to say, them as has gets.
Mm. Which is that whole concept of comfort and discomfort, right? So the brain has templates and how it views the world, and so sometimes it's much easier to be in discomfort if you've got a template for that and you know how to manage it, rather than being in something that is not as chaotic and not as unhealthy. Yet you don't have a good template to navigate that world, so you don't have strategies to navigate it. You don't know what that looks like, and the brain gets very overwhelmed by not knowing
Yeah.
what to do with that, right? And I think that goes back to very biology kind of driven experiences. Something that I've seen you talk about, and I really wanted to discuss this with you as well, was just this rapid emergence of that terminology of ADHD and kind of what we've had in there, and this huge uptick in stimulants and what that looks like. I was telling some colleagues the other day, when I got into the world of mental health, I never thought I would be seeing that, diagnosing that, even using these pharmacology interventions as much as we do. Like, it's kind of radical. Like, and I know your book, the concept of like obedience and those kind of things. Tell us about what you've seen in your work with that progression.
Yeah. I first became aware when I was a boy. This was called hyperactivity. And I first heard of this when I was a senior in high school. And I read Vance Packard's book, The People Shapers. And I was appalled to learn uh, that grown-ups were giving speed to little kids. And I've changed my mind about a lot of things since then, but that's not one of them. Yeah, back then, the diagnostic category known that came to be known as ADHD was called hyperactivity. And I knew what hyperactivity was, just as I know what depression is. I know what anxiety is. I know what madness is. I don't think any of these conditions are drug treatable brain diseases, but I know what they are. And I knew what hyperactivity was. It was a diagnostic label applied almost exclusively to elementary school age boys who were fully expected to grow out of it. It was just the most rambunctious boys in an elementary school class, and it was some people decided it was less trouble to drug them than to give them an outlet for their energy. But since then, so I know what hyperactivity was. What the heck is attention deficit hyperactivity disorder? If it takes 11 syllables just to say the name, that right there makes me skeptical that this is properly considered a drug treatable brain disease. And in fact, this has gone from a diagnostic category, as I said, applied almost exclusively to elementary school age boys who were fully expected to grow out of it. And now ADHD is this crippling, lifelong disorder that requires daily drug treatment from cradle to grave, and which is responsible for every human woe under the sun. And they like to come at us. The people promoting this diagnostic category are always telling us that ADHD causes divorce, job loss, educational underattainment, reduced life expectancy, yada, yada, yada. Well, there's no evidence there's such a thing called ADHD that is causing these problems. Nobody gets the label ADHD without his behavior, or now her behavior, his or her behavior being considered a problem by somebody. So you're looking for trouble in a population you already know is troubled. That's like betting on which horse is going to lose the race after the race is over. And there's no evidence that drugging either children or adults reduces the likelihood of any of these bad outcomes. I went into this in my book into some detail, the MTA study, and this was far and away the longest and far and away the largest randomized controlled trial of stimulant drugs for children with ADHD, diagnosed with ADHD. And 600 children randomly assigned to one of four treatment groups: drugs, drugs plus therapy, therapy alone, or usual community care. And the researchers were not able to demonstrate the drugs produced any improvement in any of 24 outcome variables they looked at. The only long-term effect they were able to demonstrate, the only one, is that the drugs stunted the kids' growth. And no, they didn't, quote unquote, catch up. And the longest study of ADHD drugs for adults was only 6 months. And again, they found the longest randomized controlled trial of these drugs for adults diagnosed with ADHD was 6 months, and they were not able to demonstrate any benefits of the drugs. And all these studies were done by researchers who were all pro-med, who made their living prescribing these drugs. They don't help, and why does anybody think they should? I mean, life is a matter of if becoming a better person were a matter of taking the right pills, then just about everything I think I know about being human must be wrong. But that can't possibly be the case. If becoming a better person were a matter of taking the right pills, we wouldn't be sitting here discussing it. We would all be taking the pills. There is no way you could keep something like that hushed up.
Well, and it makes me think, as we were talking about that evolving of DSM-2 and 3 and kind of how it gets into that, as you were talking about, just kind of hit me. One of the things that we've seen in this huge uptick, and you do see some people who, they struggle in certain instances, but a lot of it becomes a reaction to the world that they're living in, right? And so it's, sitting in a chair for 8 hours a day. And so now you're, looking up at the board and you need to be quiet for the teacher and all those things. I know like Brett Weinstein and some of the work that he does, he talks about, school is just so brand new in the entire, concept of being a human. And so it's almost as if what we call inattention, poor focus, all these things is not as much a lot of organic brain dysfunction as much as it's maybe certain personality constructs that just don't align with the world that you're living in right now.
Oh boy, do I have an earful for you. Last year, I spent 2 brief stints as a middle school tutor. And not my usual line of work, but I had some time on my hands. They needed a guy, so it was a match made in heaven. And oh boy, do I have an earful for you and our listeners. Yeah, in the first place, there's nothing wrong with the kids. If you talk to these kids one-on-one or in a small group, they are amiable, friendly, polite, courteous, deferential, all leavened with just the right amount of wisecracking. There's nothing wrong with the kids. And point number 2, I am absolutely not setting myself up as better than any of the teachers. I could not do what they do any better than they do it. Now, having said that, these places are a joke. My first stint was in the suburbs. Here's how a typical class goes. Uh, the students all file in, some of them stopping to get hugs from their teacher. And then the teacher spends 3 minutes pleading with them to be quiet, talking about how they're giving her headaches, basically begging for mercy. And then she will read the instructions for the assignment or have a computer generated voice read it. Why not have one of the kids read it? And the assignment consists of filling out a worksheet. The girls are done in 10 minutes and sit staring into space. The boys are sitting gabbing among themselves. I used to get angry when I would see those memes. Girls rule, boys drool. But having spent some time in a middle school now, I can understand why a girl that age would feel that way. So just I can't say they're doing nothing, but they're doing very little. At one point, and then my next stint was in the supposedly elite public middle school in the inner city. Now, I thought the suburban middle school was a joke. This place made the suburban middle school look like Harvard. My first day there, I was just supposed to be observing. A boy and a girl got into a fight. To be honest, they didn't look like they were doing much damage to each other. Another boy took the first boy by the arm and led him over to the other side of the room. And then he turns to me and says, "This goes on every day. I'm tired of it." The teachers don't even try to get the kids to be quiet. The teacher stands up in front of the classroom and shouts over the din to keep up the pretense that they're doing something. And a typical assignment consists of filling out a worksheet with some words blanked out, and the full text is on the screen in front of the room. How is that learning? And, as I enjoyed spending time with the kids. But this is just such a colossal waste of their time. And these kids are going to graduate. Oh, there was one scene. There was a young teacher. She was obviously very dedicated to her craft. And she asked for a volunteer to read something on the screen. Nobody volunteered. She said, "Boy, if you can't read by now, how do you think you're going to do in 8th grade?" And the kids just yawned. They knew she was bluffing. They flagged them through kindergarten through 7th grade. Why wouldn't they flag them through 8 through 12? None of these kids, not even my star student, could add, subtract, multiply, or divide without counting on her fingers. Not one of them. This is 7th grade. Now, I remember in 3rd grade, we learned our times tables. And our teacher decided we weren't learning fast enough. And she sat us down and read us the riot act and said, "Look, you have to learn this." And I am deeply grateful somebody cared enough to make sure that we knew this was important. And as a society, we've just lost the societal consensus. To say to these kids, "Look, this is important. You have to pay attention to this." These kids are going to get out. They're not going to be fit for anything but the most ill-paying jobs. And they're also going to be ripe targets for any demagogue that comes along. It's almost as if they'd planned it that way.
So
Yeah,
what?
and
Yeah, one of the things I hear you saying in that is that because we all had, or, all of us at this moment, right, walking on earth, in Western culture, we've had some kind of formal education. And so within that, there has been this evolving of education, what that looks like. But what I hear you saying is that, in those instances, you felt this purpose that was articulated in something, right? And so
Mhm.
now you're in a place where maybe the purpose isn't articulated, or maybe they don't see that. And I think that's something, I mean, that opens up a whole thing. But this whole discussion now of that, you know, childhood lasts for a very long time, where, you know, 500 years ago, you were 13 years old and you had a family and you were a farmer. Now you're 13 years old and you haven't even rebelled against your family yet. So there's definitely this huge shift in what that looks like. Where do you think that comes from? Maybe even biologically, like how did we get to that place in that movement?
Well, of course, people are reaching. I mean, in the old days, you might undergo puberty at 16. People got married about 16 or 17. Your adolescence may literally have been a season, and of course, now adolescence is going on. People reach puberty earlier, 12, and adolescence continues through 20s, even 30s. Yeah, I don't know what to do about that. But I mean, an extended childhood is not in and of itself a bad thing. Um, I mean, that's what separates us from the apes.
Mhm,
But what I'm concerned about is they're just wasting the kids' time. And how does this tie into ADHD? I mean, I don't think drugs are going to help, but I don't blame a drowning man for clutching at any straws.
mm,
Yeah, my childhood was the 60s and 70s. I don't believe there was ever a better time to be a kid, before or since.
mhm,
Um, I do not remember my childhood as harsh and punitive. In fact, I remember it as quite pleasant. It was just a given. Grown-ups were in charge,
mm,
and everybody knew that. Even the juvenile delinquents knew it. I mean, we had kids who would break the rules when grown-ups weren't looking. Oh, yes, we had those. But even they would not have dreamed of directly challenging grown-up authority. And that meant kids were free, and we were free to go about the business of learning. And kids were expected to sit quietly in class, and they did most of the time. But we also got to run around during gym class, during recess, and after school every day until dark. And yeah, and now I fear these children are losing their childhoods to these time sucking video games. I mean, sure, we had television, a little black and white job, three channels, which had to be all things to all people. Uh, and most of the time, there was not anything on a little kid would even want to watch. And I fear these children are having their childhood stolen from them by screens. Just recently, a friend of my wife's came over. She had two boys, they're something like 9 and 11. And I volunteered to get them out of everybody's hair for a while. So we walked down to the local playground and we got there, and these boys, they're like, well, what are we supposed to do now? I can't even find the controller on this thing. No, they didn't actually say that, but that was kind of the impression I got.
yeah, and I think it does bring up this whole concept where a lot of the, I mean, we could go into conduct disorder, oppositional, all those things, right? But at the end of the day, a lot of the things that we pathologize and that we medicate and then we work on and get, some people get improvement, some people don't, this whole gamut, it's all just a reaction of something else that's occurring, whether it be socially driven, whether it be terrible things that happened to you as a child, whether it be the food that you consume, whatever that is. And so what I'm hearing in that is, from the work that you've done and what you've seen both biologically and socially, if you find yourself not feeling well, it's much less about what is the label and way more about what happened. What has occurred to make this reaction of sadness, anxiety become so overwhelming that now I'm struggling to act as a human. And
Yeah.
I think that is something that's so important to kind of articulate.
Yeah, more than 60 years ago, Thomas Szasz, who's kind of the grandfather of the anti-psychiatry movement, said, in every other branch of medicine, a diagnostic label is an explanation for what has happened to the patient. In psychiatry, a diagnostic label is a justification for doing something
Mhm.
to the
Mm,
patient.
mm. I mean, I would, and I can see that both from a way you use it, but then also how you bill for it, how insurers kind of drive that. I mean, the diagnosis has to align. Like, I mean, how many times I've seen people who you have to put the label on it to even see the person, or the insurance isn't going to pay for it. And so, yeah,
Mhm.
this kid's having some bad things happen to him. They don't meet all the criteria of all the other stuff, and so then it's like, well, here's this label, which ultimately then impacts them for the rest of their life, right? Getting into the military, doing whatever they want to do, and so I do think it is important, if you're listening to this and you find yourself not feeling well, it's not that feeling unwell is not true. It's that there's probably something driving it. And rather than kind of leaning into the label and leaning into all those things that kind of looks like that, working with someone to figure out what is it? What has happened that's given me this emotional, this experience reaction that then leads to behaviors and all the other things we see? Because ultimately, just leaning into the label and throwing another chemical at it, by and large, hasn't been the most effective way of managing.
Yeah, and it's not just that the drugs don't help; they cause tremendous harm. Bipolar disorder, that's all the rage, and bipolar disorder was almost unheard. It was called manic depressive disorder back then. It was almost unheard of, and it was unheard of among children. And we began dosing adults with antidepressants, and the number of manic depressive adults or bipolar adults exploded. And then the experiment was repeated. They began dosing children. And the depressive disorder was in the same people who had been taking these drugs. And psychiatry made no bones about this fact. And they claimed these drugs were revealing, were unmasking the pre-existing disorder. Well, wouldn't it be better to leave it masked? And the experiment was repeated a second time, began dosing large numbers of children with antidepressants and stimulants. And then bipolar diagnosis in children exploded. And again, the same children who'd been given these drugs. And it's just a degree of willful blindness that I find absolutely shocking. But it's still going on. Doesn't show any signs of slowing down.
And I think, and you bring up a great point with bipolar disorder, because you do see this mood lability that happens in all humans, right? We all have highs and lows, good days and bad days. And then there is, kind of just like we do with schizophrenia, we kind of put this other concept that exists of where people can become really unwell, right? Like for whatever reason, their brain just kind of becomes super overwhelmed, probably because of other things that's happened to them, right? Or they've consumed something that has like elevated their brain past what they needed to elevate. But I do wonder, just in the work that you've done, how do we as a society then like navigate this? Like, what is your recommendation from that movement of you're in a world now, there's all of these diagnoses, there's all of these discussions, there's all this stuff going on. How do we get a hold of it to where we don't have so many people being a version of unwellness?
Yeah, I agree with Peter Bregan. Just never take psychiatric drugs. going to a psychiatrist, of all the things people do on a routine basis, one of the most dangerous is going to a psychiatrist. And we need to start talking about uh, alternatives and to work on the things that give human beings a sense of connection and meaning and purpose: family, friends, community. And that's a lot easier said than done. A long time ago, the comedian George Burns said, "Happiness is having a large, loving, close knit family in another city." And what he meant by that was that we all want to know there's a big, loving family for us to fall back on, but we don't always want to have to do the hard work of maintaining it. And yeah, that's absolutely correct. I mean, building meaningful connections is hard work, and probably most of us could be doing a better job of it. I think it's and today people got a lot of their sense of identity and belonging from their jobs, and today millions or tens of millions of people are working on part-time temporary contracts. They can be gotten rid of easier than you can flick away a booger. Uh, and this is not a stepping stone to something better. This is the nature of work now. And I remember reading, I'm sure you read recently about, or you saw the thing in the news, that woman who died at her desk on a Friday afternoon, and nobody even noticed until the following Monday morning, and her body was already decomposing. So I'd say that's a good thing to keep in mind when you're setting priorities in life. Uh, the people at work, when something bad happens, the people at work won't be there for you. But so we need more than ever to work on building connections with family and friends and community.
Mm. And I love that discussion of community and just the importance of having people around you. And I think, kind of to rebuttal on what you said, I think as a provider, right, and as we all kind of navigate this world of figuring out how to make people well, when we clump a lot of different things in it, but as a provider, we have to find ways to figure out what is going on that doesn't look as conventional as maybe our training does. And being able to spend time with other people and figure out, hey, you know what? The reason I can't sleep is not because I have insomnia. The reason I can't sleep is because I've had 500 milligrams of caffeine that day. Or the reason that I'm feeling really anxious is not because I got anxious for no reason. It's because maybe your marriage is falling apart, or you're having issues at your job, or all these other things that are kind of going on around you, and spending time with people so that they don't end up taking things or doing things that ultimately either makes them worse, or they kind of find themselves wrapped up in this new world that we have that can really become unwell. Because ultimately, people get sad, people get anxious, people become unwell, and it's figuring out the why. And I think what your research has kind of shown is that more times than not, there's a reaction to something. Maybe
Mhm.
not trauma, right? That was a big thing in, like, was it the 70s, and everybody thought that happened. Hypnotism got big and all the things. But ultimately, something is going on. And just spending time to try to figure out what is it, man, that
Yeah,
that then allows you to feel well and ultimately build that community, have those people, have all those things, and not find yourself attached to so many other biological concepts. Because at the end of the day, it's very complex, yet very simple. And so it's just trying to navigate what that looks like. That's
yeah.
kinda what I got
And I
here
would
to say.
say taking care of the bodies we're born with is an important thing.
Mm,
Uh, a lot of people's mental problems, I think, could be fixed if people would just do a few simple things: exercise every day, eat sensibly. And by sensibly, I don't mean this fussy hypochondriacal obsession with glycemic index or fat grams or carb grams or whatever, but eating in moderation. For most people, far and away the biggest issue in their diet is they eat too much, period, full stop. So exercising, getting lots of sleep, uh, eating moderately. That right there, I believe, would fix a lot of things that are wrong in a lot of people's lives. And of course, staying away from alcohol and drugs, legal and illegal. And then beyond that, we need to work on building meaningful connections. And as I said, that's easier said than done, but it's no excuse for not getting on with it.
Yeah, and I think that, when you look at it, right, up until that movement that you talked about, that transition in 3, you even seen that, right? In the early 1900s, there's great research on using magnesium for people who were thought to be magnesium deficient, and they gave them magnesium and their depression went away. And then zinc, and like just trying to figure out all these other things that weren't these major chemical compounds. It's like, well, maybe this is the reason why. Or maybe let's get you connected with some other people in your life, or let's, find you some more, whatever that is. Right. So I think that it's not that we're going backwards in any way. I think it's just maybe we've kind of lost our way attempting to find some concrete footing in a world that moves really fast. And
Mhm.
because of that, we lost our way. And so I think as we move forward, with the work you're doing and a lot of the other work that other people do that are kind of in your camp, it's how can we help people become well and meet them where they're at rather than just get wrapped up in the whole thing that we've been in for 30, 40 years now.
Yes, yes, I agree.
Awesome. Patrick, thank you so much, man, for the discussion and the work you do. How can people follow your work? I know there's a couple different outlets that you're involved with. What does that look like?
Say that again.
I said, how can people follow your work that you do? I know that there's a couple different outlets that you write through and that you talk with. How can people follow the work that you're doing?
Oh, yes, I have a website with a very easy to remember name, patrickhahn.net. And it's got links to all my books and all my writing on the web. I'm finishing up a new book manuscript uh, right now, and I'll be happy to tell you the subject of the book, but not today.
Oh,
Until the book comes out, I'm maintaining radio silence on this particular subject. You know the old adage, if you strike at a king, you must kill him.
okay. Well, so people following your website, I know you do some work for Mad in America. We'll definitely post those in the links here on the show. And then we'll kind of look forward to that new book, man. And I'm excited to hear it. I imagine if it kind of flows in the theme of all the stuff that you're discussing, it's definitely going to shed a light in a different view of kind of how we see something.
Hmm. Yep.
Awesome. Patrick, thank you so much, man. Thanks for being with us today. I know our listeners will have a lot to kind of digest and work through with this. Thanks, man.
Okay. Thank you.